Anyways, my name is Farhad. You already knew that. So here's a little bit more about me. I'm a big car enthusiast. My background is in philosophy and logic. And somehow I found myself in software, still trying to figure that out. But all kidding aside, I'm based out of San Francisco. I work for McKinsey, where I get to travel around the world and help Fortune 500 companies. It's a really great, I've been really enjoying working with the team here. We have a lot of our colleagues here as well. So that's enough about me. Last year I was fortunate, I gave a talk on WebGL and production. And let's see here. And I had an amazing time hanging out with you, getting to talk about something I absolutely love. But this year, the plan of the talk is something a little bit more practical, something a little bit more intimate, and we'll get back to that in just a second. But I'd like to kind of just start off and say thank you so much for all of you being here. This is phenomenal. I really mean that. Thank you so much for being collaborative, being so supportive. And a big shout out to the JS channel crew. I'm not sure if they're there. The lights are super strong. But a big shout out to everybody here for kind of bringing us together under one roof and experiencing something so phenomenal. So thank you so much for that, guys. Yeah. So, the title of this talk, it's kind of cut off there, but it's called You and I. Can anybody guess what this term means? I just made it up in the shower. I thought it was clever enough. But I'm curious, anybody can take a guess at what this term means. You don't need a mic to shout it out. What is that? UI. Well, what's the ampersand about? I'm sorry, I can't hear. You and I? Or who am I? All right, all right. It's a lot of confusion. I guess that gives me something to talk about. Cool. Yeah, you and I. This is actually, as I mentioned last year, the talk was on WebGL, but I felt it was not really grounded, first of all, because in our traditional modern-day development, we don't get to work with this cutting-edge technologies. And I found myself over the past year working with a lot of different teams and different organizations, different constraints, different skill sets. And I've really been feeling this pain point that I think we've all encountered is dealing with traditional UI development. And as much as we love the visuals, we love the interface, the people who are actually creating them, our experience of building these UIs to be reusable, composable, it's a pain point, right? When I think a lot of us were so excited about shipping a product or a service to our clients or our customers, but I wish we had the same type of passion and same type of interest for having these building blocks behind our applications also served to other individuals who can consume them. So I thought, how do we approach building user interfaces, UIs, that's meant for you and I? It's a little bit more empathy here, right? And I'm not talking about some AI-driven button, which would be crazy, but an interface, some components that we talk about modularity, we talk about encapsulation, but a lot of times my experience from what I see, including myself in my own code base, is we build these components that are not really reusable. Their styles kind of bleed outside. We start out with good intentions, but it's really hard to kind of scale these applications. So the biggest thing that I want to kind of take away here, I hope that I do a good job of articulating as best as I can, but hopefully you walk away with something, is coming up with these basic principles, these standard guidelines for ourselves and the teams that we work with to help us become better developers. So again, it's building these components that is meant for you and I, a little bit more empathy, and having these things actually reusable, and the different strategies for consuming them. Does that make sense? Yeah? Cool. All right. This talk is inspired actually by a talk given by Christopher Chadeau like 2 years back. He did a phenomenal job. He worked at Facebook, and some of you may have listened to this talk. It talks about the different issues that Facebook was running into with just traditional CSS. And I call them the Chadeau's commandments, right? As if he came out with the tablet in his hand. He's like, these are the things that we follow. And it was really powerful. And whether he actually prescribed it inline styles are the optimal or the perfect solution for our use case. I think what it did for the React community is inspired a lot of developers to go out and create a lot of technologies around inline styles, around CSS and JS. For example, I think we had Max here, but he gave a phenomenal talk yesterday on styled components. And these are the type of inspirations that have inspired a talk like this one as well. So actually, Max did a great job yesterday. He covered inline styles. He talked about CSS modules. He spent obviously a good amount of time on styled components, rightfully so. I'm a big advocate of writing CSS and JS. I think it has a bright future. But how I like to distinguish our time here is I like to kind of talk about the principles, the best practices, things that are not tied to an actual technology, but more so working with different teams and different constraints and how we can adhere to certain standards to help us become more effective, right? So we'll have a very high-level overview of some of the different strategies and different concepts. We'll have time for some live coding sessions at the end, but I would like for us to kind of stay a little more high-level, just to kind of get the principles, some of the guidelines, and some of the things that I've learned, some of the things that I've uncovered, some of the things that I'm actually just experimenting with. I just think they're good ideas, and I'm just tinkering with them. They might be useful for you. If they're not, please let me know, because then I can save some time, right? I don't have to keep experimenting with them either. So it's inspired by that, and I just want to make sure we focus more on the principles, more of the guidelines as we move forward. And something that, man, this is kind of unfortunate because, oh, nice. Sweet. All right. So how do we actually come up with these strategies for building reusable components, right? Max, I'll reference Max again one more time here. He said something, if any of you remember, something really, really interesting. He said it in a joking manner, but there's so much truth to what he said. He had a list, right? And he said the list is all green. That list was a guideline. It's the guideline that I think he uses to analyze, to decipher other frameworks, other technologies. In fact, he wanted to create his own based on that standard. He said he was biased to it, which is rightfully so, right? We have these guidelines, we have our own standards, but I think what I've experienced over the past couple of years is that many of us developers, we don't have these clear guidelines. So we're easily persuaded, we find ourselves confused, or we just go chasing after the next cool technology. So I found it to be useful as, yeah, technology is cool, these different toolkits that are coming out are awesome, but it's really valuable to have a clear set of guidelines for yourself and for the teammates that you're working with, for your colleagues, and for other organizations. These contracts are, I think, essential before you start any UI framework, right? And I've took some from Shadow's concepts. He described them as problems in his skills and in the problems that they were facing at Facebook. I took some of these, I added some other ones, you'll see why. That I just, you know what, here's a sample UNI contract that I want to adhere to for a given project. And I want to make sure that when I work with teams, this is something, let's say, for example, we try to adhere to. And contracts, just like Max mentioned yesterday, they're biased, right? But these guidelines are necessary. So the topic of this book, this entire talk, is actually having a set of guidelines here, adhering to them, and going through different strategies for fulfilling these. It's not tied to React. It's not tied to CSS modules or inline styles. It's more so, we have these principles, how do we actually go about building them or adhering to them? So we start out from the really basic primitive blocks of just traditional CSS. We see how far we can get that, and if our requirements just need more, we go to a different strategy. And we just cover a vast range of strategies to adhere to these. So we'll start with the first one, no global namespace. By the way, I like to kind of be split conversation, so don't be shy. I make a lot of mistakes. If you make a mistake or whatever, just feel free to shout out anything that you want to shout out. Hopefully it's relevant to the talk, obviously. Just don't shout out random stuff, but I like to just for this be a conversation. Can anybody guess what it means by no global namespace? I'm sorry? Nothing is shared. Good. That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, this whole idea, right, is we don't want things to be just global by nature, to extend, right, to things that they shouldn't extend to. The second one is, this is something I've been experimenting with, and it's quite extreme, right? I just came up with it, been experimenting with it, and I'll kind of explain to you what it does, what it means, and give it a try. And And I'm saying it's pretty extreme to be following this pattern, but I just have it in the back of my mind when I'm developing a UI component that's meant to be used by other people. And I think about this. I'm like, I try to adhere to it as often as I can, but there are certain situations it doesn't make any sense. Unidirectional styles, I'll draw a diagram a little bit later on what that means. But this whole idea is that if we thought about our styles in the same way as we think about our data, how it gets applied to our application and how it changes our application, shouldn't we think about styles in a similar fashion as, let's say, for example, in Redux, we treat the data as a source of truth. It flows down from the parent to the child. And what I mean by this is, what if we had components that are intra-focused, right? All of the styles only get applied internally. So you have a component, you have a button, right? Background color, that's set to that button. Text size, right? Maybe padding, maybe width. Width is kind of questionable. Can you think of some CSS attributes that are not intra-focused? I'm sure you guys have used them. Just take a moment really quickly and think about some CSS attributes that are not intra-focused. Which one? Great. Any more? Think about, right? Styles that don't go inwards. They're not intra-focused. Float could be. We'll talk about that. Yes, margin. That's a good one. Absolutely. Right? So this is an idea, right? I think about it, I'm like, hey, whenever I build a component, I want all of these styles to be unidirectional. Why? It's because I want the style to flow downward, right, from parent to child. If I have an element, the margin telling other things around it to behave in a particular way, I don't want that component to tell other components around it how to behave. Right? Wouldn't it make more sense for the parent to lay those things out? Wouldn't it make more sense for the components to be only intra-focused? They're just responsive, and whatever context that they reside in, the parent tells them how to actually behave. Does that make sense? And it's really difficult to actually do this properly. At first, I was like, oh, this is amazing. This is simple, right? How come we just don't do this with all of our styles? But it's quite difficult. But it's a really, really good standard that I have back in my mind at all times. How do I maintain unidirectional styles? Dead code elimination, obviously, CSS tends to grow it gets quite bloated, right? We have a lot of styles that just don't get refactored, they don't get removed, and I understand that, right? When CSS files just grow massive and our applications are huge, it's really hard to remove styles without thinking that you're going to break something. Shareable constants. Again, I love 3D and I love graphics and I love when I work with WebGL, I have access to the power of being able to share variables amongst different contexts. With CSS, we don't get that. CSS Next, it allows for that, but it's not widely supported, which I think is awesome when CSS in the future where you can actually change CSS variables through JavaScript. If you're not familiar with that, I highly recommend looking into it. It's amazing. So that's another thing I look for, right? We're building interactive applications. I want to be able to share data between CSS and JavaScript. Next one, deterministic resolution. It doesn't happen as often as you might think, but when you're asynchronously loading styles into an application, bless you, things, depending on how they're being loaded and how they're being applied, you can have a non-deterministic outlook, or just a view, right? So I want things to be a little more deterministic. Isolation is huge for me, right? Again, this kind of goes to the idea of building these components with a little bit of empathy, meaning that if you build them in isolation, if they're well encapsulated, all their dependencies are self-included, this thing is isolatable. If that's a word, it's isolatable, right? Extendable is that the component is protected. You don't want things just randomly manipulating it. It provides an interface for other component consumers to actually modify the behavior. The last two are extremely important for me, and I hope you don't have to be an open source developer. You don't have to be creating the next biggest front-end framework or UI library. This is so simple that we could do this. It's just hard to do with UI, right? Because a lot of times our components, our UI elements, are so entrenched in the application, it's hard to document a particular piece. And things like Bootstrap, Foundation, they do a great job with their documentation, but it's just the visual looks. You're not sure what the underlying mechanisms of these things are unless you look into the source code. And again, it's a big open source project, so many people are contributing to it. So how do we as developers in our normal daily jobs, right, be able to adhere to the same type of standards? So those two things I just threw up there, we'll talk about it. You guys are good? Yeah, making sense? I hope I'm touching on something quite intimate as developers, or if you're an aspiring developer. These are things that I've encountered over the years. I just want to make sure I try to do my best to hit home with this. All right, and I have a gift for you guys. I really mean this. Over the past several months, I spent countless mental cycles, many days, honestly, not sleeping, to be able to deliver this gift for you guys today. I had such a great time last year. I want to be able to make sure I give you guys something to walk away with, something tangible that you can go back and kind of reflect upon the things that you learned and have some feedback. And what that is actually, I just published this book literally this morning. It's provided as an open source project for you guys, and I made a JS channel as a package. You can just download the entire book for free. And all of the source code is there. The documentation is all there. And there's a link in the GitHub. Thank you, guys. No, honestly, this clap this is all for you guys. I was so inspired last time, and some of the pain points that I felt. I was like, you know what? I'm just going to document everything that I have, give it back, and provide it to you guys. But I can just tell you, I put my heart and soul into this thing, so I hope you find it useful. And I just published it like literally 3 hours ago. So if you want, just go ahead and go to that link. It's on GitHub, and there's a link on there that goes to LeanPub. You'll see a little section there. It's called JS Channel. Just click on that. You can just download the book for free. So go ahead and do that if you find it useful, and I hope that later on you can go through the chapters, and it's a lot more in detail, and hopefully make your future lives as UI developers better. All right. So I'll give maybe a few minutes for everybody to go and just download, at least, you don't have to download the book, but everything is encapsulated as far as the source code, because we're going to go through the code examples, and hopefully have some time at the end for some live coding sessions. So I'll give you guys maybe 5 or 10 minutes to kind of at least download the GitHub repository. How is the internet for you guys? Pretty bad? And if one person is lucky enough to download it, if you'd be kind enough to kind of maybe give it on a USB or through, just send it over via Bluetooth or whatever with your neighbors, that'd be awesome. Everybody's got the link? You guys are there? Just raise your hand if you're there and at least download the, wow, man. So that's why I can't connect, because you guys connected. Thank you. All right, good. All right, cool. Should I disconnect this back in? Anybody's got an interesting story or a joke to tell? Yeah? Dude, you are a brave, brave man. Speak up, please. Come up here. Okay, good.
You already said that curiosity across the audience, at least myself, about what we are going to discuss. But I was just trying to correlate what exactly we are going to discuss further.
Absolutely. Good question. Actually, we're going to go through each, at least at a higher level overview, we're going to go through just the introduction of this book. We're going to go through the chapters of building a very simple application through different strategies. So we'll cover, obviously, we'll start with a very simple CSS application. We'll convert it over to using CSS modules, CSS preprocessor, but it's more so about that UI contract that I laid out, what kind of practices we can employ to actually adhere to that. So not just because we're using CSS modules or inline styles, but how does it actually help us to adhere to that contract that I put up?
But if I correlate it correctly, the
Yes.
frameworks like Bootstrap and others
Yes.
already doing it for us. It's
Okay.
like the points, whatever you have, bullet
Yeah.
points, whatever you have mentioned.
Yes.
So if I come from the order, reset.css, base.css, the container level CSS, and the custom CSS, whatever we have to write for the specific application.
Absolutely.
So are we doing anything apart from that, or how it is?
That's a very, very good question. So one thing is, like, for example, I use Bootstrap all the time, right? Bootstrap is a great, great UI library, and it's one that's been provided to you, right? But a lot of times, we have to build our own UI components, right? And we use Bootstrap, and I would argue that Bootstrap doesn't meet a lot of that criteria. It is non-deterministic, right? Because if you bring another external library and try to align it with Bootstrap and things are loaded asynchronously, you can have a non-deterministic resolution. The styles are not encapsulated to the components, right? So it just takes a lot of effort, actually, to do that. But more importantly, Bootstrap by itself is not enough for you to actually build an application, right? If you're working in an organization, and let's say you need to build a header, right? This is something I run into all the time. I work with an organization, and they have this common header and footer that they're like, hey, I want this to be reusable. But then I go from one team to another, they're using completely different standards, and these guidelines these things that people have inside of themselves, the guidelines by which they actually analyze the world around them, they decipher what's right and wrong, it's not outlined clearly. For example, in Bootstrap, I just kind of know it works, and I have some ideas behind it, but I don't know the guideline by which the developers behind this, what are they actually using to decipher what's good and what's bad? And these are great developers, right? And they're prescribing a lot of kind of methodologies. But within our own teams, within our own personal projects, we don't have these clear standards. We don't actually even talk about them. So for example, myself included, I come into a team, I'm like, that's not a good idea, or that's a great idea, right? But I have this guideline by which I'm actually judging things, right? And I just want to make sure we become clear of that. So I guess the idea is, yes, how do we actually build a Bootstrap within our own organization? Or if we're using Bootstrap and we're adding on top of it, right? That's what we do, right? We bring in a library and we use it. But those things are not reusable. We're just excited about shipping out an application. Not all of us are open source contributors wanting to build the perfect modal. But what I'm trying to get at is, I think it is actually quite doable. If you start out with clear guidelines and have everybody on your team level set, and understand where you need to be with each particular component, you can actually get there quite easily. I hope that answers your question. It's a little more of a practical approach. So anyways, guys, if you've downloaded this, raise your hand. If you need to download it. Anybody's waiting to download it? Okay. Should I wait? It's good? All right, so the code, all the code examples are on the side of the code directory. The manuscript just has if you spot any grammatical mistakes or any errors, just please open a pull request to it. So let's just start with the application. Obviously this thing's going to be gone through React, but React is not, the idea is here that we don't have to use React. A lot of these principles, right, you can just be using just traditional CSS, HTML with Bootstrap, and you'd be good to go. Just following these basic principles would be useful. But we're teaching this through React because obviously React seems to be a lot of our domain, or we're interested in learning it, so we'll cover it. But the focus here is not React. And for those of you who have used React, how many of you used Create React App, the nice utility? Yeah, sweet. This thing is phenomenal. For those of you not used it, it's just a basic command line. You just do create React app in your application, and it gives you a lot of the latest features already configured for you. You get ESLint, you get Webpack, all the nice and dandy features you would expect in the modern React framework or project. So what is the app that we're building? So we talked about, obviously, this idea. Here's the unidirectional styles that I was mentioning about. We'll try to implement this. It's quite difficult, but CSS is easy as we first start, but as the application grows a little bit more in complexity, it's harder to maintain this. Sorry, guys, I was hoping to have split screens for this, so my apologies if I'm scrolling really fast here. Okay. Once things installs. All right, anyways. We build a very, very simple to-do application. I try to keep things as minimal as possible, purely just for that Occam's razor principle, like the principle of parsimony is having the minimal amount of work to try to get this idea across, right? We have a basic application, there's a list, and a list of to-do items, right? This kind of helps at least try to drive a lot of these points home without introducing too much complexity into the code base. So once we build this application, you can see it here. Really simple, very basic CSS animations. And if you look at the source code here, chapter 3, we can start. We start out with everything being global. And not that I'm saying, okay, cool. So not that I'm saying when we run into React applications, things are really written this way. But I just wanted to have it as a starting point. If you're new to React, you start out building everything kind of global in one file, and then we extract this out. So we have just an unordered list. It renders a list of elements. On the click, You toggle the to-do, nothing too fancy, and a component amount, we're not fetching any APIs, we just set the to-dos. So if you're familiar with React, this is pretty straightforward code. It's probably one of the simplest applications you can build. But everything is global by nature, right? We have our styles here, which are really poorly written because everything is applied at a global level, right? So in the next phase, we see how we could apply. Perfect. Let's go through this. In the next section, we just employ some basic UI principles that we mentioned to see how we can refactor this code base, all right? So instead of having everything global, we just create a basic React app component called app, right? And all that does, in the first chapter, or I'm sorry, in this particular section, instead of having the UL element, can you see that? We call this thing, called it just a to-dos list. So a lot of times we have lists and we have list items, right? And I was thinking, you know what? Wouldn't it be better that we have common lists and we have list items? Instead of having the entire list tied to the actual items itself, what if we build a component that's just purely a list, super generalized, that renders its children, right? So our list of to-dos, right? The to-dos themselves are an actual item. They can be rendered in any particular list. So instead of having our UL and our LIs tied together into one component, what if we extract out the ULs and all it does are lists? It applies some basic functionality, again, in a top-down fashion to any children that are passed down to it. Does that make sense? This is something that I generally don't see in projects, right? Lists and unordered lists are things that are just a collections. They're heavily tied to the items that they're rendering. Does that make sense? So that's the first thing we do here, right? We say, you know what? We're going to convert our to-do list into a component that renders the children, which is a to-do list item here, right? And let's see what these components look like. They're quite simple. You can see here an unordered list that renders the children. And this seems quite minimal right now, right? Nothing too crazy. But you can see that, like for example, we talked about how you have a list that may lay out particular things in a fashion. Maybe things need to be centered when there are only 4 elements. Whatever complex list that you may have, it's kind of good to kind of separate the items in the list from the list itself. So that's that. Next up, we have our to-do list item, right? And our to-do list item, it's literally tied to that particular instance. It's just an item that receives a few props on handling its click and rendering a display, right? That's it, super focused. And again, why do we separate this out? Because now I can feed this unordered list, this to-dos list, different types of items, which we'll see here shortly, without changing much code at all. I didn't have to create another list or some other components to be able to handle that. I just fed a different item into it. And we'll see how that works pretty easily. Another thing we employed here is, how many of you have worked with, when you guys worked with CSS, like Suit or BEM? How many of you used that? Raise your hands. Okay, cool. It's just a basic, clever naming convention to be able to kind of scope your CSS in the hopes of not having your CSS clash against one another. So BEM is just basically block element modifier. You have a block, you have a class, and you have, for example, if you have a footer, the elements below, you have footer underscore underscore the element, and if you have modifiers like active, non-active, whatever, those are the modifiers. It's just a kind of a clever naming strategy to help organize your CSS and to kind of avoid naming collisions, right? And in a very similar fashion, something that we can do with our components is the CEM, right? Component element modifier. At the top of every single component, right, we introduce the name of the component, right? At the top, class name, we put the name of the component right there. Everything gets somewhat scoped to that component. And all the styles sit within it. Does that make sense? This is something I generally don't see, right? We build a component, and then somehow we have styles within it, or the component name is in the middle. What if we just do component element modifier, right? And another concept, very similar, is introducing, instead of a component element modifier, what if at the very top of our application, we introduce a unique identifier for our application. So we house all of our components in an ID because there's, let's say technically in this application, there's only one application instance. So you have our components, but you also scope the entire application with an ID that's identifiable. Can anybody guess why this may be useful? We understood the idea of scoped, right? This idea of scoped classes, right? Why would it be useful to scope the entire app with an ID? And why do we choose a class for a component? Shout it out if you know. Yeah. Can you repeat that? That's exactly right.
Theming.
Yeah, so the ability to create sub-apps, right? So imagine you have these components, right? And you want to use this component in a different area, right? What if you namespace your entire application with an ID, because generally IDs are more semantic for one instance, and we use classes for components because semantically, components can be or may be rendered multiple times, right? So if we namespace our entire application with an ID, right, if I put the same component in a different context, right, it can get themed differently. It's a very simple way to have theme support, but also, since an ID on an element gets high specificity, if we bring another library, we naturally get a little bit more specificity with our own styles, right? So in this case, you could see that all of our classes here are prefixed with a to-dos app. Does that make sense? Because that's the entire instance of our application, which you could see here in the public. It's called to-do app, and everything gets injected inside of that. Make sense? Cool. Make sure I didn't forget anything here. Namespace, application, namespacing. Yep, unidirectional styling, and let's see how we did that here. So before, our list, right? Our list itself was positioning itself. Our list items were actually telling margin bottom. They were saying, hey, I don't want anything to get close to me, right? So we bubbled that out, right? Our app here, you can see, it's talking to the child itself. In CSS, since it's cascading, it's kind of global by nature, we're just able to do that. We don't need that particular interface. But you can see here, I extracted out the to-dos list class within the app because the to-dos list is sitting within the app, right? It's telling it, hey, I want margin top 50 pixels or margin top and bottom 50 pixels, and I want it to be centered. And the max width, the list itself doesn't want to say how wide I need to be. Just by default, I have it 100%. The parent tells it, I want it to make sure that it's 800 pixels wide. And you can kind of see this is the idea of writing kind of more empathetic components, right? They're just responsive, but the parents are allowed to modify the behavior with quite ease. Make sense? This whole idea of unidirectional styles? And very similarly, in the to-dos list, you can see that the to-dos list items were affected by the list itself. The items don't say, hey, things above me should not be more than 10 pixels closer to me, right? We're not using margin within the list item. We use it in the list up top. So that's our first pass of this conversion. And interestingly enough, a lot of the applications that I run into, right, I see a lot of times, I see a UI element, and it has styles that are easily scoping, they're going beyond its own scope, right? I'm sure maybe many of you, including myself, I've done it several times. I think about these sibling components, and I just see clearly that this component is affecting the styles of this other component, right? So this basic practice, we don't need inline styles. We don't need this particular stuff. Just this basic idea of unidirectional styles can kind of help us get there, right? And these are basic principles I think are constant throughout time. If we're working with CSS, you can follow these basic principles and write a better application. All right, so the next section we have, let's see where we leave off on our list here. So these little asterisks, it means that it's kind of pseudo-fulfilled, and the check mark means that we actually fulfilled it in that particular refactor, right? And pseudo, what it means is that we solved it by some clever naming strategy. We app namespace, we component namespace, we did some unidirectional styling, but we kind of pseudo-fixed it, right? We still have the issue with no global namespace, right? But maybe in your applications, this idea of no global namespace, because the contract that you came up with, you don't need to have these absolutes that we're going for, right? This might be more than enough for your application, right? So that's just kind of one of the things that I'm talking about, is having these guidelines and seeing what's needed within your team. We obviously achieved unidirectional styles. We don't get dead code elimination. We don't get minification as far as minifying our CSS classes. We don't get shareable constants. We get somewhat of deterministic resolution, pseudo-fulfilled. We get somewhat of isolation because our components are requiring their own styles in and they're namespaced. Isolation, extendable, and documentable and presentable, we'll talk about a little bit later. It's a really cool tool to help you, as you're building these components, be able to do that at the same time. In the next section, we talk about CSS preprocessors, right? For those of you who work with CSS, how many of you work with a CSS preprocessor? Please raise your hand. All right, good, most of you. Can anybody shout out what's the one that you generally use? Wow. Did somebody say less? All right, good. They were much louder than you guys. You guys need to yell out. Yeah, SAS or less, right? Can people just, now there is no shyness here, right? Almost every single one of you uses a CSS preprocessor. What I just explained, how would you use a CSS preprocessor we're not gonna be able to go anything above our contract now, but what would you do to help us maintain the standards that we've already adhered to? All of you guys use CSS preprocessors, so think about some common things that these preprocessors offer us to help do what we're doing here in a little bit more elegant fashion. I'm sorry? Nesting? Great. Can you explain why nesting would be useful here? By the way, this group right here, most phenomenal audience. You guys should come up here and talk because you guys are awesome. But I'm sorry, what is that?
I mean, it should be useful because it's just giving the styles to the children.
Yes.
But it might be less than useful maybe because it's not very implicit. When you go down and look at a deeper level, it looks like it's only talking about that child and not the entire.
Yep,
cascade.
absolutely. But you mentioned nesting. Nesting, we'll actually talk about how it's very useful here. Dead on. Anything else? Emulates HTML structure. Well, I like that one. I didn't even think about that. I'm a very visual person, and I think when code visually looks nice, it's easier to consume, right? It's almost like art. That's a really good one. I didn't even think about that. Thanks for bringing that up. Another one? Just think about this. You look at this page, right? You see a lot of repetition, right? A basic principle, right? Try to remove as much repetition as possible. You mentioned nesting. So what is that? We see to-dos list, could be nested down. We can get a little more aggressive. We can do the ampersand, right? To-do list item. We can just do the ampersand so we don't have to replicate to-dos list, right? A lot of useful things. Another one is variables, right? We talked about how this thing could be themed in different contexts based on the application ID. What if I turn the ID itself of the application, since it's a constant, right? I set that at a global level. So then, with flip of one variable, right, you can change this entire thing, and we kind of see how that works. So let's see here, styles. So we extracted our globals. We want to clearly say that these are our global files. We require them at the top level. Why? Because we want to adhere to this whole idea of unidirectional styles. Since it's at the very top, I don't ever want to see a global style within a component. Again, it breaks that whole idea of unidirectional styles, right? We should... I'm sorry? Yeah, exactly, right? Font sizes. Oh, if I increase that, we should put a variable for that, make it easier. But I won't be able to see it on my screen. So I guess there's many more of you than me. So maybe I should not fight back here. I thought you were saying that you can make your font size, like based on the RAM and M, make them responsive. What is that? Oh, that's... Actually, with WebStorm, it doesn't work. But, look at this. With the little pinch one, it actually works, which is cool. But under the command plus plus should work. I hate that it doesn't. All right, so this whole idea of unidirectional styles, we're still adhering to it, right? It's still somewhat simple. We've extracted all of our global styles, put it into a global file because we want to make sure these are global and they only get required at the top level, right? Then, next up, we introduce this idea of a theme, right? And this is where I define our app constant, right? We call it a to-dos app. But you can imagine that you have a different theme, and everything within your styles gets this prefix without any type of repetition. So if you go to our components, you could see here, our SAS, we interpolate on that component, which is called to-dos app, and our classes all got nested, right? And as the gentleman up here mentioned, the nesting, we did the same thing here, right? Makes sense, right? Is that pretty useful so far? Maybe some of you already employ this in your current projects, but some really basic principles that kind of help you write better UI, right? Another thing we did here, we introduced, because it's been so easy to build upon this architecture, if you go through the exercises, you'll see that it's so easy to introduce a new component. We just introduced a new component called to-dos list info, and all this does, it's another list element that just captures the state of the to-dos and telling how many are completed and how many are not completed, right? Very similar. It's got the to-do list item, we set it at the top, and it takes some basic classes, right? And you could see in the app.js, since it's the parent, it's the one that renders the to-do list item. It generates all of our to-do list items. And at the end, we put a to-do list info. Can you guys see why we extracted out the list from the items themselves now? Right? Instead of creating another list or somehow injecting that list, the list info, right, somewhere and then hopefully try to style it, we just extracted out those two different functionalities and be able to just inject another list item in there, right? Straightforward. Now, can you guys, that contract, I'm not sure if you were paying attention clearly or you could see it, do you think that contract that we went over, the things that were fulfilled and pseudo-fulfilled, do you think we fulfilled anything higher than that? Yes or no? Do we get any extra functionality about all the work that we did here? Were we able to introduce dead code elimination? Were we able to introduce shareable constants? Did any of the things that were pseudo-fulfilled, like no global namespace, were they actually fulfilled now? Yes? Raise your hand. No? Raise your hand. Man, it's really binary. Maybe? Maybe? All right, good. Yeah, actually we didn't do anything. We literally didn't add any extra functionality. But yet, I think we did do something that I didn't capture in that contract, but I'm not sure it's something that's really something you want to kind of discuss with your team, but developer experience or developer UX, right? It's much more elegant, much easier, right, to write this type of code and maintain, right, than I think the previous version. So if you find yourself in a project that you're using CSS and you want to use a CSS preprocessor, I think these are some basic principles you can take away and write some decent components, right? And as long as you as a team have a clear contract and adhere to that, you can write really good scalable code within your organization, right? But we didn't really come here to just basically pseudo-fulfill. Let's say we work in a set of constraints that we will actually need to have deterministic resolution, because we have a lot of external libraries or we have a large project. We actually need to have shareable constants because our app is extremely interactive, right? So we start approaching in our CSS modules, right? Now, Max did a great job yesterday explaining CSS modules. It's just a way to kind of locally scope your classes, right? Do you want me to go over that again? Unless some of you were here yesterday, some of you were not. Should I explain that? Please raise your hand. If not, we can save the time and go to something else. Raise your hand if I should explain it again. Okay. I'll quickly do it. So this idea of CSS modules, right? Let's look at the code really quickly. It'd be easier to kind of talk about it. Actually, you know what? We should go through this because this is an area where the idea of unidirectional styles, and maybe I'll need your help on this, because I couldn't find a clear solution. There are many different strategies that I employed, and I found one of them to be somewhat decent, but this is a point where maybe you may want to break this whole idea of unidirectional styles, and it sucks. I decided to continue with it. It's a little bit more on the extreme end, but you'll see why it's a bit difficult to adhere to that standard. So, actually I forgot one bit of code here, so I should probably fix that. We no longer are using this idea of class names, but what you do, you write your CSS the same way as you did before. I decided to go with a camel case convention because what happens, now you require styles and give them a name. And within this component, right, instead of doing class name, instead of actually tying it to the actual class name that you wrote, you import the styles and you reference it off of that object's key. And what's kind of happening underneath the hood, you can kind of think about it this way. I think it's a very clever solution. Let me see if I can find this. It'll be a little bit easier to see here. Cool. So you can see here, right? Up top, we have this style called title, and it renders the word hello world in an H1 tag, right? But actually what's happening underneath the hood, right? Our CSS is being converted, and since we're writing our templates in JavaScript, we're having this kind of, you can kind of think about it kind of like a dictionary lookup or a hash object where it's mapping the CSS names to a unique hashed value. So underneath the hood, title is getting mapped out. We can give you semantic names. In your Webpack loader, you can give it, say, I want the name of the component or the path, and ideally, you want this unique hash, right? So when you reference it, you're not referencing the CSS class itself directly. It's being, through a level of indirection, it's being mapped out to something that's unique. Does that make sense? It's a pretty clever idea, right? You kind of think about it. You can do this yourself without a build tool, right? You can think about creating a large dictionary in your code, right? And you create unique keys in this object, right? The unique keys are the values. The keys are the semantic names. So if I have a footer class, right? I have footer dash something, and I give it a unique hashed value, and I just reference that in my code. But instead of building this and managing this large object with CSS modules with a nice build tool or a CSS loader within Webpack, it does this thing behind the scenes for you. What's powerful about this is that you actually get locally scoped CSS because these names are all completely scoped to that component. You don't have any type of name collisions. And can somebody help me understand or just kind of try to think about why it's so much more difficult now to have unidirectional styles? Where before, if you recall, we had to-do list, and in to-do list, the CSS or the SAS file, it had a class called to-do list item because it was manipulating the child components, right? Why is that more difficult now? Actually, nearly impossible. Can anybody guess why it's nearly impossible now?
So the class names are not unique now. They might change, so you never know what they'll be in future.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's a generated unique name, and when you go into production, the name could change, right? The only way you can have these classes actually scoped properly, you have to actually import them. And CSS modules offers this word called a compose, where you can require other styles and compose them, right? You can merge them with your current styles. But you know what sucks about that? Is that if you want to build encapsulated, well-isolated components, if you're having one component require the styles of another component, what are you doing, right? That's not isolation anymore. You have absolute dependency between two components, right? So if you want to use compose, I love that feature, right? You require the styles of another file, and then you extend your own styles. But again, deep, deep dependency. I can't have a list item by itself unless I require this other thing. That sucks. Right? So which one do you give up? I don't want to have this deep dependency. Do I use this composes word? Right? What do you do in this situation? I want to go more on the extreme end. I wanted to adhere to the idea of unidirectional styles. So how do I do this? What do? You go to this next idea that we employed, right? This idea of extendable, right? Where your components provide an interface for them to be consumed and be able to get manipulated by. Bless you. So when components, right, have particular styles applied to them, maybe some things should be affected and some things should not. So what you do, you provide an interface to the to the parent components that consume them to be able to change them. And how does that work? Can anybody guess in React? What do you do to provide an interface for another component to consume? We do this all the time with data. How would you do it with the styles? I heard somebody. Yeah, props, right? You pass in your styles via props. And the thing is, we do this with inline styles, which we'll see, but it's kind of strange to do that with CSS. You're passing a name, right? You're literally passing a name. But there are many different strategies. I found this one to be the one I just wanted to employ for the purposes of this book. And let's see what that looks like. So if you go to chapter 8. Don't worry, guys. We'll do some live coding here. And I hope your laptops are ready so we can have some fun. So this is not it. Here we go. Can anybody see that? Yeah? Okay, cool. So to-dos list info, right? These components now, they provide an interface for other components to be able to manipulate their behavior. Because with CSS modules, you can actually get protection now, right? Because you can't reference that particular element because it has a unique class, right? Now, we actually provide an interface of what things are able to be changed. This is great now because our components, when you build it in a particular fashion, and you don't want people to actually manipulate things in a dangerous way, now you provide an interface for things to be changed, right? So let's see how that looks. So in our styles up here, just like before, we had a to-dos list and a to-dos list item. We passed those particular keys to our to-dos list. And up here, P styles, which is short, I just called it prop styles, right? You're merging the prop styles and the internal styles together, right? So you can see in the class name, right? You have the styles to-dos list, and then you merge it with the prop styles to-dos list, right? And can you guys kind of guess from the code why I'm doing prop styles second and the other one first? I'm not dancing, huh?
Because the parent overrides.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. I heard something about scaling. Well, think about it. I'm so sorry, I can't. For inlines, yes? Overriding, thank you. I heard scaling, my apologies. Yeah, that's exactly right? You don't want your style to take precedence over the styles that are being passed in. You want the consumer of your component to take the higher precedence, right? There's something a little bit quirky here. Why? Is because CSS modules, right? I'm not passing the actual styles down. I'm passing the unique value from the parent down. So you're running prone to this issue that you have actually class things being applied, right? And it's a bit non-deterministic because if you open up JSBin or just your favorite editor here, if you apply two completing classes on an element, right? Sometimes it's kind of hard. It's hard to know which one is actually going to take precedence. If you have background color red, background color green being passed down, and you're applying both of those classes onto the same element, who wins? Can anybody guess? Which one? That's what I thought. Thanks, by the way. Thank you so much for being brave and confident enough to just yell that out. That's what I thought. I'm like, oh, nice, perfect solution. We're in business. It wasn't the case. It sucks. You won't believe this. It's probably simple, but I had to experiment with it. The last style written in your style sheet, right? I was like, come on, how come it can't be the order of your classes? This would have been a perfect solution. I maintain unidirectional styles, right? But it's actually the order. This is the whole idea of non-deterministic resolution, right? You're not sure how these styles are actually being loaded into your page. So it's the last one. Even though it could be the first one, I can have 10 classes after it, but because if that class name is defined at the end of your style sheet, it wins. Sucks. But anyway, I still wanted to employ this idea of unidirectional styles to give it a try. And of course, there's a fix around this, right? You just increase your specificity at the parent level, so you just have two hash values passed down. But again, this is what I was talking about. You're kind of extreme as far as following this. So in many situations, because I wanted to adhere to this standard of unidirectional styles, as much as I love CSS modules, I started considering maybe I shouldn't use them, right? And this is the idea that I'm talking about, that I don't think we should be tied to particular technologies or toolkits. It's good to know the principles by which you analyze everything with. To have these clear guidelines helps you decipher what to use and when to use them. And one of the reasons I also wanted to employ this is because the next level of this, we introduced inline styles, right? Because with inline styles, it's easy because instead of passing class names down, actual strings, you're passing the styles themselves down. So let's see how that works. With minimal amount of work, we're passing our styles down via style because it's provided to us in our current Webpack configuration. We follow the same, we didn't change anything. But with inline styles, I actually got unidirectional styles now, right? It worked. And Max mentioned this yesterday. Inline styles out of the box, they don't provide you a lot of the complex CSS things that you need. Media queries, animations, right? Pseudo selectors, they're not provided to you with inline styles. By the way, has anybody here used inline styles in production? In a large application? Nobody. See, this is crazy. Yeah? That's in production? That's amazing. What was your experience like? Laughter? Is it good or bad laughter? All right. Yeah, actually, I had a really interesting task. Like, I had a project, and we need to build everything with inline styles, but that's what they wanted. And you'll see in the next chapter, I just built this little nice theming library for inline styles to achieve what we needed, and I had a lot of fun. I actually had a lot of fun building it, but I don't think I would use it. But what's cool is that it gave me everything that I needed. And in fact, as Christopher Shadow mentioned, and including all the other things that I added onto his contract, it fulfilled everything. I got unidirectional styles, I got dead code elimination, because with inline styles, you can actually say which styles are referenced, which ones are not, so you can remove those particular styles, right? You have constants that can be shared between JavaScript and inline styles, obviously, right? So you get everything. But what was interesting, that it just didn't feel right to me. As much as I love JavaScript, it just, at the end of the day, still didn't feel right to do inline styles. But we used it, I loved it, but it still something feels a little bit iffy about it. And we'll talk about that soon, why I think CSS is probably still the better approach, and maybe CSS and JS I think has a lot going for it. Things like style components are definitely something to pursue because I think they have a much brighter future considering how much browsers have had many, many years to optimize CSS parsing and rendering and inline styles haven't had the same treatment, right? And CSS Next, it's amazing, right? So I think it's kind of, if it was me, I would double down more on CSS itself and tools that at least compile down to CSS over something not. But anyways, inline styles, and there are some situations that are very useful, which we'll see. We'll do some live coding together with. But something that was said yesterday that I'd like to kind of make clear, with inline styles, you do not get pseudo selectors, you don't get media queries, but very simply, there are many libraries out there that makes inline styles fully fledged. Has anybody heard of these? Has anybody used them? The gentleman in the back who uses this in production, do you use a library to make inline styles more full-featured? No? So a simple one, it's quite robust, it's built by Formidable Labs. It's called Radium. Right? And with Radium, you just wrap your entire app, this thing called style root, and we can actually inject CSS into our global. We normalize, we inject our global styles now, and in our to-dos list item, we could see here in our styles, we actually have hover states. We get all of this. A few things like toggling, maintaining steady, still have to do it in JavaScript, but it's pretty much there. And with actually, I didn't have to add any extra work when I already had inline styles working. It was just that theme wrap, the style root, and your components, they get enhanced with this little Radium higher order component function, and that's it. You have that. So in cases, and we'll kind of talk about where inline styles could be useful, if you have, like, let's say, a single page and you have a lot of dynamicness and that need to change on the fly, inline styles works flawlessly, and we'll see that here in just a short bit. So anyways, I'm sorry, guys. Obviously, I'm keeping this super, super high level. If you feel the exercises go extremely low detail, and I just don't want to go that deep level for our talk here. But you can talk about, it talks about how all these different strategies are employed within the different strategies to kind of maintain the same type of principles. This is the part that I'm most fascinated about, and I think it's really important. And if you're working with React, I don't see why you shouldn't be employing this. Angular, I don't believe it has it. Last time I have checked, they haven't been using, they don't have a tool like this. I don't think Vue does, so if you want to build a project like this and contribute to the open source community, I think it's awesome. And here it is. Well, before we get there, let's talk about this one. Let me just install these dependencies. Chapter 9. In this chapter, what I wanted to do was, we talked about theme support, right? I wanted a way to have a theme, and I wanted to have variables, and I wanted to be able to have users change the entire site, because I love real-time capabilities. I love 3D graphics. I love that real-time interaction without some sort of complex build process, right? And I wanted the ability that a user can click on an element, or change a particular profile setting, and the entire application state changes. It's much more dynamic, and you don't need any sort of refresh. With inline styles, this is super easy. And I built this little library called theme wrap. You can kind of think of it as like a GIF wrap, but for your app. It just provides a theme. And all you do, you wrap your entire app with a theme wrap provider. I think we saw something very similar to this. Max built this for style components. I'm passing the theme that we had from earlier. Same exact theme, and all of our styles now become a function, and they get theme passed in, right? So if I change any of those variables, like the primary color, right? The user wants to say, you know what, I don't like blue, I like red on my application. They just change that primary color variable, and the entire app just reacts without any sort of refresh at all. It's a pretty pleasant user experience. So once this loads, we can kind of go through this really quickly. So you can see here, all the components now, we kind of decouple this entire dependency of requiring our theme and our variables in through every single component. They just become functions, and by having everything wrapped inside of a theme wrap provider through React's context, everything has our variables provided as long as they're connected. So just experiment with this really quickly. Any questions so far? Has any of these concepts, have you run across them? Have you employed them yourselves? Or is there something that maybe you just find like really strange about some of the concepts that I've talked about? Do you think something like unidirectional styles is something you would use? Yeah. Yeah, there's two people. By the way, thank you for making this more of a conversation. I hate this one-way conversation, so this is good.
Yeah, I have used these unidirectional styles, but the problem that I run into them that when to make generic components and when to make these unidirectional styles, right?
Yep.
So where you have a button component, you have a navbar component, and then you are using them in particular different pieces of your application. Then you are writing unidirectional styles at that point of time. Then sometimes it makes sense that you write those unidirectional styles, but you are overriding those base styles. So sometimes I feel that just to leave all those generic styles and include them in your unidirectional styles so that it makes more sense because you are overriding them anyway most of the time.
Yep.
That's a problem that I run into.
Yeah. No, that's actually that's a practical concern, right? And we don't want to talk about theories here. That's something we run into all the time.
Exactly.
So, but again, this is what I was thinking, is that instead of being, like you mentioned you're building an application, right? And I understand if that's your objective is to ship out an application, that's your objective, right? Maybe you don't want to build such generalized components. But I'm just thinking that, hey, while you're already in the effort of doing this, what if at the same time, you're creating generalized enough components with same defaults, right? With decent defaults, and then you provide an interface that when I bring this component into my application, I just override what I need, right? So that's the way I think about it, right? I think to myself, hey, I'm building this. This is reusable, and I want to build another site that has a similar functionality. Let me just create a general one, right? That's kind of what I think about.
And again, that's a problem that comes up, that you think, we actually think that we are making unified styles. Then we think to make them generic, right?
Yes.
How many times you're going to make it generic? That's the main problem that comes up.
Perfect. I love that because the next one is the idea of presentable and documentable. Really plays well to this. It's good to build your components in isolation because from the beginning, you think about that, right? And I completely understand that it takes a little bit more effort ahead of time, but if you're working with a team of 2 or 3 people, that's okay.
That's okay,
right?
Yeah.
But you all know, right? When we work a lot, in my experience over the past couple of years, when I just travel around and work with different teams, one of the biggest pain points that I constantly encounter is that one individual thinks this way, one individual thinks that way, but if we have that clear guideline, and I know it's a little bit upfront work, but it just makes it so much better. And more importantly, we have our application, which is awesome, but all the building blocks are also shippable products, right? They can be consumed, and that gives me great joy, right? So I always think about how much joy do I get from this, which gives me a tremendous amount, and then some components are absolutely crap. I don't want it to be reusable at all. I don't even make those general. But this is that's a really, really good question, and I really appreciate the practicality of it. I just think about what does it take to make this thing general, and then I bring it into my context and manipulate it. The problem is, what I've seen, it's easier to make a decision if you build a component by isolation already, because you're already in the right context, you're already in the right environment, right? And then you think about, how am I going to bring this into my application? Versus what I've seen is that you start with this large boilerplate code, and man, good luck trying to make that generalized.
You just cannot do that.
Yeah.
It's so difficult.
And you're afraid of just breaking a lot of stuff. So I just think that, again, having a clear guideline, clear contracts amongst yourselves, the organizations and the teams that you're working with, from the get-go, really, really helps.
But don't you think when you're making isolated components, we have already defined but we have exactly done that when we were making those generic component classes, right?
Yes.
So isolated components, the difference is with the component, you have multiple components combined.
Yes.
And you have created a whole new component, composable component that
Yes.
consists of more than one component.
Yes.
You have made it generic. Now you want to think how to integrate that into different components.
Exactly.
Rather than just building, the straightforward components like button and all that Bootstrap another application does. But the problem that comes is if you want to make them generic by writing into your application, you have to override them.
Yeah, good luck with that, right? And
Exactly.
I mean, I won't mention which library, but I was just using this a couple of weeks ago. Override some of I was using a modal, right? And the moment I kept switching the device, it was so heavily tied to how the body tag was employed that it was just a non-usable modal. And this is for a large library, right? So I think about, man, this thing is built for the open source community, but it just doesn't have that empathy that I was looking for, right?
Exactly.
That for it to be able to work for many different contexts, and it's just flexible enough, right? So I just think for a lot of these large applications, if we just start with the right foundation, the right setting, it helps us get there. I'm not saying we should aim for perfection in the beginning, but at least the right trajectory will get us there.
At least just make a design patterns before we go ahead and make shippable products, so that we all agree to certain amount of directions and the UI contract that you just gave.
Absolutely, and I think these concepts, this contract that you lay out in the beginning, are from a business standpoint, from a designer standpoint, are intelligible and it makes sense. So designers can also think about the same sorts of things, right? And it's easy to pull requests and actually build into your project. So, and again, I think that right trajectory is huge.
Exactly. Thank you.
Of course. All right, so we talked about this live reloadable theme, right? So we were just talking about design. I think whoever's a designer here, this is probably a designer's worst nightmare, is this list that I just created. This is why you should not let an engineer design anything. So yeah, anyways, you saw the original one was quite grayscale. I like just simple shades, just black, white, it just looks good to me. But this one, This person wanted to get super fancy, right? They have the primary color red, secondary color is green, tertiary color is blue. They love colors, right? But every time you click on this, right, what I'm doing is changing all the themes variables, right? And you can imagine that you have an entire application with a few clicks, some basic configurations, your entire app just changes. So I think this is something really cool. It's super easy, and just look into the code. It's theme wrap. It's so simple to build something like this, right? And I think inline styles, if you need something like this, if I need I just think about it, if I need a single page, and I need some customizable features for a user to change, this is great, right? I don't need some complex build process to be able to change my styles on the fly. Cool? I know this is kind of a pretty hideous UI, but it is what it is. All right. And I didn't get your name in the back. My name is Saeed? Zahid? Zahid? All right. Sorry if I missed. I have a hard name too, so my apologies if I butchered that. So this will help what you were getting at. So you brought up a very good point about, oh, it's already here. NPM run storybook. For those who are React developers, how many of you use Storybook? Right? What's your experience like with it? If I'm sorry, I would love to hear.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah. I use Storybook as both a dev environment to play around with the new component that I was building, and also to ship it out as a static page where other people can check it out. And I also used knobs and React docs to generate a documentation. So it's pretty easy. You just write the comments in the prop types and it generates the docs for you.
That's exactly right. So this actually answers, I think in a very direct way, the concern that you were bringing up, and I think the solution that we're talking about here. I think if you start with Storybook here, let's see how it works. It's really easy, right? It provides an interface, an elegant interface, where you can build your component in absolute isolation, right? And you can see the dependencies. Is it affecting things outside of it? Because it's by itself, right? It's really easy to think, it's much more clear to know what you're doing, right? And also, out of the box, it gives you documentation. So now, from the get-go, you're building components that play well in other contexts. And I like to just kind of show that here. It's really, really simple. So, for example, our components here, and one thing I love, probably many of you follow, I co-locate everything that's component-centric inside of that directory. So, styles. We have it called story, and I just have that file called a story. And what this is, I create a story for a to-dos list, and I have this thing called add with info, the default view. Here's what it is. Renders children. I generate some children here, and it's there. This thing accepts custom styles, and these are the keys that it requires, right? And that's it. I created 3 stories, I documented this, I built it this way, and now I can give it to a business, I can give it to the designers, and more importantly, how many of us have massive amounts of UI elements in our code base, but even as developers who know the code, we don't know what those components are, right? I have to go talk to somebody, say, hey, oh, wow, you already wrote that? This is crazy, because of lack of documentation. This way, your documentation is perfectly aligned with how you're building the code, or building the component. So really simple. You can see that I just created a few stories here. Let's see what this looks like. Just a few moments. This is something that whether it's Storybook or something else like similar to this, I highly recommend employing this right from the get-go of your project. All right, we are in action. There you go, right? So this is the default view. You see, I have a story for to-dos list. It renders its children. It accepts custom styles. Maybe I shouldn't accept these styles because these are awful. To-dos list info, you can't see it because, see right here, immediately I could see I did something wrong here, right? It's right behind this. So that means this particular element, it has text align right or float right, right? This is something clear. You wouldn't even notice this as you're building it, that you did something that could have broken its principles, right? I'm like, oh man, I didn't think about this. I put the text align on the component itself, right? Immediately evident that I did something wrong here. And by the way, this is literally within the code. As I'm building my components, I build them in this interface, completely by itself. So here it is. Here's the to-do list item. It accepts this. Here's the completed state. Obviously, the default styles are ugly. And this one accepts custom styles via props. Accepts custom styles via the other props, so completed ones. And at the end, it handles a click. You can see this toggle to do at the bottom. And one of the last chapters, it shows you how to just build this up. It's super easy. But what's cool is, look at this. You get documentation. Your prop types, everything is provided for you here, right? I could see that here's the handle clicks. It accepts P styles. It's not required, right? Here's the code to generate it, right? Already provided to you as you're building the components. Pretty useful, right? So this is one of the strategies that I've been employed within our projects. Maybe you don't have such strict guidelines that you have to adhere to these guidelines that you're setting out in the beginning of the project, but this tool has been amazing in building proper UI components, and I highly recommend just introducing it in your toolchain. So I hope this little journey of building a simple application through different strategies, not so much tied to the technology, but the principles, right? There's a lot more, honestly, this is obviously a short amount of time, but there are a lot of different principles that are on there, and I just try to explore them and see what works for you. So I hope you found it useful. I hope you're able to use it in the future. Whether it's right and wrong, please give me the feedback. I can save time, others can save time, and we can build better user interfaces together. Thank you so much. I know, obviously, I engaged you guys so much throughout the conversation, but any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, first of all, really an interactive talk. Thanks a lot for that.
Thank you guys. You made it interactive.
It was a pleasure having that talk with you. I have some questions about the React Storybook.
Yes.
So like we create with BEM, we create block, then we create element, then modifiers.
Yes.
So modifiers are used to, for variants of the same block or element component. So with React Storybook, I can create a block or an element, and I can create different stories that act as modifiers.
Yes.
Exactly. I just have to pass the CSS for that.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Right. And by the way, obviously at the end of the book, we were using inline styles to document it. But it could be anything, right? It could just be just traditional CSS. And that's what I'm trying to get at, is that I think we're all chasing the next bleeding edge technology, but sometimes certain things help us achieve our goals faster, right? But with what I love about Storybook, it's just a way to build in isolation and provide a documentation from the get-go. Absolutely. If you want to use to follow the BEM approach, you can do that. You can document, say, here's the top level, here are the elements that you can modify, provide that interface, and here are the modifiers that you can switch. That's a great example for that.
Thanks. For these modifiers, if I'm creating a story,
Yep.
would I be adding those modifier classes to it, or I don't need to do that because all those styles are obviously applied in the inline style level?
Yes. No, I would create a story personally. It takes so little, and you're testing it anyways. You want to see if the modifier is working, right?
Exactly.
I recommend every single thing that your component can do, document it. Because you as a developer are going to enjoy coming back to your own code base, right? Because we all know that. Forget about other people's code bases. Even coming back to your own code base 5 or 6 months later can cause a lot of pain. So documenting every single one, and instead of looking at the source code, sometimes it's just nice to look at the visual interface and all the different things that it can do. I recommend writing a story for every single functionality.
And it works with every custom React component, or I think you have to create a React component and then apply your stories to it, right?
Exactly. It's within React. And that's what I'm saying. It's such a great tool that any of you who's interested, we should build this out for other things as well. Or just figure out a way to make it more generalized.
It surely looks really promising because the problem that we comes up with creating BEM classes, we have to, take care of ourselves to create all those modifiers that don't create problems with or don't overlap with other modifiers. So, but this is doing, you just have to create stories.
Absolutely.
And it really helps us. It really trims down all our effects.
Yeah, and I think I just love that once you have a particular set of guidelines, you just include that. And more importantly, I just love the fact that it provides you isolation. So I don't have to build a component within a context. I build it knowing exactly what I'm doing. I become so much more aware of what this component is actually doing. Because a lot of times I just do things willy-nilly, and then I realize later on, like, wow, this thing had much more effect than I expected it to do.
Exactly. And the other thing is just my personal opinion that we really think that creating inline styles like atomic design methodology,
Yes.
or using tachyons as a framework, basically having all those CSS logic in your HTML as inline class names or styles. We
Yes.
really think this is the way to go. Just like we have these, we have style components and we have
Yeah.
web components. So most of the component styles are either added into the same block level as a component or the inline styles.
Yeah.
So
No, I think honestly, I mean, I'm sure there are people that have used inline styles much larger, but I worked with it for a very large project for 8 months. I loved it, but even at the end of the day, I just didn't think it was the right solution. And I think even when Christopher Chaudot talked about it, it was just explaining, he was outlining some of the issues that they were running into and why it's a possible solution. I think CSS has a brighter future. One of the biggest things that I chose inline styles is because I wanted shareable constants. I want to be able to have interactive applications. With CSS Next, you can actually literally change your variables through JavaScript. So I think CSS, or I think CSS and JS with styled components or other libraries like it are super powerful, and they're only going to get more powerful.
I think we have gone from a phase of creating BEM classes and then have structured HTML with class names with BEM or other methodologies to writing CSS and JS with style components and other similar methodologies, and also this React storybook. The web has really grown up.
Absolutely agree with you on that. But it might change. So I love change and I love learning. So we'll see where things go. But my opinion, I got to work with it with inline styles, and I love writing everything in JavaScript. But I think having JavaScript code, I mean, being compiled onto CSS is better than having just purely inline styles. That's my opinion.
Exactly, I agree with you.
Cool.
Thanks.
Of course. Any more questions?
Hi, great talk,
Hi.
first of all.
Thank you so much.
My name is Deepak. Okay, so first of all, thank you for making the book available for all of us. That is really kind of you.
It gives me so much pleasure because I had such a great time.
I hope it helps a lot of us.
Absolutely.
Okay, so from the you and I contract, one thing that really intrigued me was the unidirectional styling that you talked about, right? So like you talked about converging to the lower level, so that okay, the parent has it, and then we converge it to the lower level so that the styling gets direction in a particular direction. So I just want to ask, like when I'm making a particular component and I want to have a certain styling that is growing outward, like it has an outward convergence.
Yeah.
Should that be my parent component? Like if I want to nest components inside, and there's a basic component that I want to have a certain outward converging styling, should I make that as my parent component and then nest inside? Or
that's exactly right. That's the approach I've been taking. I'm really tinkering with this idea, and I'm trying to take it to the extreme. But yeah, I think about it in the same way that I think about data now, right? That data should be just funneled down, and I think about my style should be funneling down. And I know it seems easier, right? In the same way that before, we had components just randomly mutating the data of another sibling component or had no type of interaction with one another. I think if we treat our styles in a similar fashion as data, if we really stay true to that, I think it answers your question, right?
See, I believe like theoretically it sounds very good, like okay, a particular component is not getting into the way of another component, how that is behaving. But like as we go on writing more and more components, do you believe that, modularizing it so much that even when I have to write a component that has that has a single outward converging capability, I have to convert that into a into an individual parent component just to achieve this particular functionality?
And I think this really comes down to intuition. And I think one of the best tools that we have as humans, as developers, is our intuition. And I'm of the opinion that your intuition is honed down by experience, right? So you're right. If we think theoretically, right? Right now, I just stand here and I want to think about all the truths of the world. I'm like, yeah, break all the components down to their basic atomic level. But when I come to the real world situation, my intuition changes a lot faster than this theoretical concept. So I think you naturally find a balance as you're experiencing it, that you realize, yeah, I have a to-do list item. Should I make the text itself into another component? Probably not. And in fact, I probably will have the list and the list item together because I don't have another list in my application. But I think that really goes down to intuition, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Any other questions? Looks we're all clear. Good to go. So thank you so much, guys. I appreciate it.